Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here. It's fun to get to talk with a lot of NOAA folks that I don't interact enough with normally, so this is great. We've already been over what I'm going to talk about. A lot of what I do is sort of tangentially related to climate change, but there is sort of a pretty interesting connection, I think, down there, so we'll get to that towards the end. What we do in my lab is very much focused on the intersection between landscapes of risk, so how predators and prey interact, particularly in non-lethal ways, large-scale human impacts, how we're affecting coral reefs and other marine systems, and how we can harness the power of emerging technologies and new technologies or technologies that have been there but are now more accessible. And what I'm most interested in doing is sort of putting these aspects of our work towards development of conservation tools that are relevant to the kinds of work, hopefully, that a lot of you do. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is understanding what seascape scale vegetation patterns can actually tell us about reef health. I don't need to say this to this audience, but of course overfishing can lead to predator loss, protection can lead to predator recovery, and that coral reefs around the world have experienced widespread overfishing. Now, predators are themselves predators to many smaller fishes, such as sharks and other predators, but are also prey to humans. And one of the things I'm focused on, or the work in my lab is focused on, is how do humans affect ecosystems by changing predator-prey interactions. And I love this slide because it shows we don't know anything about what's happened before or after this was taken, but what we can see is that just by their presence, these tuna have the mackerel scared in a ball. They're not doing anything else. They're not feeding, they're not reproducing. They're just trying to survive. And pretty soon they'll probably be food for seabirds at the surface. And so it's just that presence of predators, even without killing any prey, can vastly change how prey behave and how they interact with other parts of the ecosystem. So just summarizing, humans, of course, we like to eat predators first. We know that by killing their prey, predators can change prey abundance. They can lead to the changes in the abundance of prey's food. And these are what we would call lethal or direct predation effects. And that's typically what we think of when we talk about a trophic cascade. But on the other hand, by changing predator numbers, we can also affect how predators interact with their prey through behavior. So just like I said, by being present, predators can change the way prey fish or other prey forage, for example, in a very simplified sense, creating fearless fish. So if we take out the predators, that creates a sense of fearlessness amongst the fish in a way that allows them to behave in a way as if there is less risk, which there is. And this can then lead to changes in the abundance or distribution of the prey's food sources. So for example, algae or seagrass. And these are what we tend to call risk effects or non-lethal effects, or a variety of terms. But the important thing is I want to point out that these can both lead to what we would think of traditionally as a trophic cascade. So a few years ago, some collaborators and I created this random walk model. If you can imagine this being a coral head in the middle of a one-dimensional theoretical reef landscape. At each time point in the model, a particle diffuses out from that. And we're going to think of a particle as an individual prey fish here. So it goes left or right with equal probability, but when a predator passes by in the model, that fish is sent back to the coral shelter. Okay, so then what that does is it creates a foraging distribution, a probability of where these fish are going to be spending their time foraging. And that, of course, is centered around the shelter. So when you put lots of these on a theoretical one-dimensional reef landscape, what you see are these safe areas where fish tend to congregate and spend most of their time, interspersed with risky areas that are far from shelter. And then based on just simple foraging, the model predicts that there should be more seagrass or algae. I'm going to just say seaweed here for the sake of simplicity, but in these risky areas. And so what you see then, if you put this on a two-dimensional reef landscape, is you see these zones, these safe zones. And that's just simply a function of where the prey fish are foraging, the herbivores. But what we can see is that from satellite imagery, this actually exists in nature. And I'm sure some of you have seen these in your own work, either from above or underwater, where we have a reef surrounded by a safe zone, surrounded by these risky areas which are covered in some sort of macrophyte. And these safe zones are typically what we would refer to as halos, reef halos or grazing halos. And these are nothing new. They've been around and known since the 60s, where they were attributed by Jack Randall and John Ogden variously to different components, herbivore components. But what's kind of neat is that now with something like Google Earth, we can just kind of travel all around the world and see these all over the place. And that's what I spend a lot of my time doing when I probably should be doing other stuff. But here we see at Heron Island in the Great Barrier Reef, there's a reef here. We see this kind of light blue area. That's the reef halo or the grazing halo interspersed with this sort of patchy algae here. Then we can go, say, over to the Red Sea and Ras Mohammed National Park. We see the same thing. So note this difference in scale. You can see that at the bottom here. So this is kind of over a bigger scale, and you can see that same repeated pattern over the landscape where we've got these little reefs surrounded by the halos, surrounded by something which I'm assuming is seagrass. I have not ground truthed this area, but would love to. And then we can go over to, say, the Caribbean and the Bahamas and see the same thing again and again. And these are just a few places that I've come upon where you can see these things really clearly just from imagery that's available in Google Earth. So it's usually Maxar worldview imagery. Again, reef, halo, seagrass, or algae. So what we've done with this is taken this idea and looked at it, for example, in the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, where you can see the red here is the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, which is interspersed with blue and green areas. So the blue areas are fished, the green areas are not fished. You don't need to read anything on this just to know that there's a patchwork. And so what we then did is, this is not going to work. I think when we switched over the computers, it doesn't, but that's okay, I'll tell you. We would be flying in and looking at one little reef here where we've outlined by hand reefs with sort of the reef itself, the halo, and we've done that for lots of reefs, lots of halos and lots of reefs, about 300 reefs, I think. So all along this entire, I think, I don't know, 2,000 kilometers something coastline. And we did that by just looking at satellite imagery and doing transects through satellite imagery going out from the coast to the continental shelf. So I'm going to be rather data-free here and just kind of give you the summary of all these different things. But essentially what we found is that in no-take reserves where there's no fishing and predators should be more abundant, halos are more common. And in fish reefs where there should be, or expected to be fewer predators, halos are less common. But we do see halos in both fished and unfished reefs, and no halos in some unfished reefs. We also saw that as reserves get older and predators are able to recover, that halos are more likely to occur. So this then begs the question is, can halos be used as some sort of an indicator of aspects of reef health? Can it be used as a remote assessment tool? And this is a picture of just an island off the coast of Jakarta, where I'm not sure if you can tell what's going on, but it's pretty much wall-to-wall roofs, so it's probably very heavily fished. And just like we in this country, and same there and everywhere, no one has the resources to send teams of divers to every reef and count every fish, right? So we need other ways to complement that, even if they're a bit more rough. But first we need to know where are halos found? Is this relevant to any place in the world or just the places we've looked? How common are halos? Do they persist over the long term? And do they have any short-term changes? So these questions are some of the things we've been working on in my lab over the last few years. So a few years ago then what we did is we expanded that survey and did a global survey of halo patterns. And basically what we did is we spun Google Earth around and went for every line of latitude, I think from 36 north to south. And for every single reef we encountered in that transect around the globe, we measured the reefs, the sort of reef area, halo area, and so on. And I'm really going to summarize here. But basically, we found them in lots of places, very, very common. And this is work that Aviv Swan in my lab did. He used to actually be part of the benthic team at NOAA and on the marine debris team. Briefly, what we found is that, yes, they're common everywhere, more or less, particularly in the North Atlantic. So in the kind of like in the Bahamas, it's very, very common. And if you look across all the reefs of the world, what you see is on about 10% you'll find halos. But if you subset that by just the ones where we see the kind of habitat where patch reefs form and these halos form, it's about 20%. So in about a fifth of the world's reefs is where we're seeing halos, so pretty common. I just wanted to show a couple examples of where we see local halos. Kaneohe Bay, I've kind of tried to outline them a bit. It's probably a bit hard to see. But you can see there are kind of lighter outlines around reefs here, here, here. I've just outlined a few, and then sometimes they're along edges of reefs as well. Also off Olowalu and some deeper water we see very clear halos. and off Midway. There are probably tons in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, but there's not a lot of easily accessible high-resolution satellite imagery, so a bit limited in what we can see. So this is where we get to the climate change part. But given primary producers' ability to store carbon, could predation risk affect carbon storage? And so we went to look at this question with a collaborator of mine, Tricia Atwood, who's at Utah State University. We went back to Heron Island a few years ago and looked at some reefs there. And what we saw, so the halo is outlined here just for this particular reef in orange. We basically saw there was about a 70% reduction in sedimentary carbon storage in near versus far from shelter across all the reefs we looked at. So what that suggests is that potentially loss of predation risk through, for example, fishing, could then reduce carbon storage in reef landscapes by creating more safe and grazable areas. So essentially by removing that spatial constraint of risk, it opens up the whole playing field of the reef landscape for grazing, which could then potentially reduce the amount of, reduce the amount of sedimentary carbon stored by primary producers. So you can see here, if you go kind of back and forth, so one is very blurry. This is from the Red Sea, but we do see that halos expand and contract over time. So you can see that if that kept going, you might end up with sort of homogeneously grazed area. But we also need to know who matters most. Like, are all predators equal in creating these effects? And Amelia Meyer in my lab has done some really cool work showing that actually it seems to be more the lower trophic level sharks that are the key predators that matter for creating halos. This is still sort of not yet published and not quite, jury's still out on this, but that's what we're seeing so far. So that where low trophic level sharks predominate, that's where the halos tend to be smallest and most clearly defined. Simone Franceschini, who's here, is a postdoc in my lab who's been looking at developing an AI model for measuring these things, because as you can imagine, measuring halos by hand over the whole world is very time consuming and kind of boring. So he's developed an AI model to basically do that for us, much faster and with probably better accuracy. Just briefly though, the reason we're doing all of this, as I mentioned before, is that we're interested in developing this idea into a hopefully useful conservation tool. So Amelia and Zach Rago and Annie and his Gold students in my lab have been looking at different aspects of this so we can really nail down the mechanisms and come up with something that is hopefully useful. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I would also really love to talk with anyone today about how, if and how you think this kind of thing could be useful for your work, because that is what we're aiming to do. And actually, I should mention that Simone is now working on a project that NOAA has generously funded us to try and develop this specifically for the Pacific remote islands so that we can have alternative and complementary ways of monitoring the reef health down there. So thank you.